Okay. Hey, Suzanna Ryan. Thanks for coming on All Things Crime.
No problem. Good to see you, Jared. How are you?
You too. So, for everybody out there, I have to let you know, Suzanna is one of my favorite people in all of forensics. And, All Things Crime would not be complete without a good discussion with Suzanna Ryan. She's an expert in DNA. She's been in just about every aspect of DNA analysis that you can possibly do. And I'll tell you what, one of the reasons that I first got involved with ASOC was because I learned that Suzanna Ryan was part of it. And I sought her out as a DNA expert from day one. And so I'm excited to have her on. And Suzanna, yeah, why don't you introduce yourself and then we can get going.
Okay. Well, yeah, as you said, I'm a DNA expert. I'm also a laboratory director of a private lab. So I've been in the field for 21 years now, which sometimes now at this point I hate saying because it dates me, it ages me, but that's fine. I started in 1999 was my first job in the forensic field and as a DNA analyst. And I've basically been doing that from that point forward. I'm also a consultant. So as a consultant, I'm reviewing other analysts' work and talking with attorneys and trying to explain, what do the DNA results mean or what don't they mean? But I am happy, like I said, to be back in the lab and doing DNA testing, doing M-Vac collection. And that's what I truly love is doing the actual work and getting the results and being able to help with some of these cases.
Now, your new lab is Pure Gold Forensics.
Yes.
And that is, well, why don't you tell us where that is and what, if you have any specialties that you want to talk about?
Sure. Yeah. So that lab is in Redlands, California. And I started there in 2017. They brought me on to basically get the lab accredited. So the lab was in existence before, but it was not accredited. And the president of the lab really, saw the potential of his lab, but really in my opinion, it's really important to be an accredited forensic laboratory. And that is something that's recommended by basically all of the NIJ and just different organizations that say, if you're going to do DNA testing, it really should be at an accredited lab. So that just kind of involved updating some protocols and procedures, quality assurance manual, things like that to get everything sort of following the accreditation documents. And then I stayed on at that point and we got our accreditation in 2018 and started doing casework for anyone, basically prosecution, defense, get a lot of cold cases through, I would say, through my affiliation with ASOC, with the American Investigative Society of Cold Cases, as well as just, I do cold trainings. I've done community and other individuals. So people tend to know my name with cold cases, which is great because I love cold cases. I think there's some people that don't really enjoy as much delving into cold cases because they're not the easy ones, that's for sure. They're not big blood stains or semen stains. It's the tricky sort of in-depth testing. Although I wouldn't say that's necessarily our specialty. We end up getting a lot of cold cases. And I think especially because we have the M-Vac, that really, we use it on a lot of cold cases. Other than that, most of our testing is pretty, industry standard testing that we can compare profiles to any other lab and have the ability to upload through an NDIS participating lab into CODIS, because no private labs are allowed to directly upload to CODIS, but we do have the ability to work with our NDIS partner and get those profiles uploaded.
Yeah, it's interesting. And before we get into your background and how you got started into forensics, you said something interesting just now where you were talking about the kind of the run-of-the-mill type of DNA testing versus the difficult stuff, and how there's so much more effort and expertise needed for a difficult DNA profile. So just really quickly, could you expound on that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's, all the DNA testing, you're doing mostly the same process. It's just sometimes it's the beginning steps, the actual examination of the evidence and thinking, even before that, maybe thinking about what evidence would be the most useful or the most probative. So, that sort of can start even before the evidence is submitted. And that often is going to be conversations with the investigator or the attorney, whomever you're working with, whoever the client is. And so I do like to start with that to kind of get a sense of what evidence is out there to begin with, because otherwise, an investigator might say, okay, I'm sending you this shirt to be M-Vac'd. And that's fine. But when I talk with the investigator, or if I look at a list of other evidence that's been collected and know a little bit about the case, then it might be better to say, you know what, I think the jeans should be submitted because clearly he was dragged by his feet based upon, what your crime scene investigators are saying, or, something else about the scene. So really those type of cases kind of, I don't want to say difficulty, but it's before it even gets to the lab, you're using your technical skills or your experience, whatever, to indicate what items should even be sent to begin with. And then once they arrive at the lab, most of the time what we're dealing with on these quote unquote difficult cases are cases that have already been tested. We already know there's no blood match, or all the blood is matching the victim. There's no sexual assault, so there's no semen present. And all we have left is probably maybe touch or transfer DNA. And so that can definitely be a lot trickier as far as knowing where to test it, trying to get enough DNA to get a profile, maybe having to work the sample a couple of different times. Maybe initially it's a little bit inhibited or it's low level. So let's clean it up or get another sample or concentrate the sample. So it can be a lot of additional steps that when you're working in a big lab, like a state lab, and I've worked in state labs, many times we've got to get the case, get the most likely sample to get its profile, get it tested, and let's move on to the next one. Because they have to. There's so many cases coming. Working at a private lab does give me the ability and the time to be able to maybe do some additional steps with the sample or with the evidence to try to get the most useful, meaningful profile.
And I would consider you an expert in trace or touch DNA. Can you briefly explain that and kind of why that is so important to actually focus sometimes, or at least consider touch and trace DNA in just about every case?
When I first started working in the field, we did not do touch DNA samples. We were looking for body fluids. So that's where you got your DNA, or, hair, or tissue, things like that. It wasn't until, so I was working for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. And this probably would have been about 2000, maybe 2003, when officers started wanting to submit quote unquote touch DNA samples. So things that they knew the perpetrator had handled to try to get a DNA profile. And initially the lab was kind of resistant to that. Like, whoa, this is going to open the floodgates. If we start saying, sure, send in these burglary tools or clothing, whatever, they kind of put the brakes on that. And then one of the cases that the lab refused, they had testified private lab and got a beautiful profile matching the perpetrator. So after that, the lab that I was working at kind of had to reassess and say, okay, well, maybe we will consider these, because I think the thought was, we're not going to get anything. It's going to be low level. We're just not going to get a good result. And again, they didn't want to open the floodgates. So after that point, then yes, it's been a lot of touch samples that we know someone has come into contact with, because anytime you touch something, you have the potential at least to leave your DNA behind. And then that DNA that's left behind can remain on the item or can further transfer to other items. If there's enough to start with and something comes into contact with it, there can be enough to transfer, and that's what secondary transfer would be. So even as a consultant, many times if I testify, or even if I maybe write cross-examination questions or just even consult with the defense attorney, it's usually on those type of cases. It's on the trace DNA, touch DNA cases where there's mixtures, maybe it's low level, and you have to just explain, listen, yes, the DNA could have arrived in the way they think, that there was a direct contact between these individuals. But let's look at some other possibilities. is it possible that there's a secondary transfer based upon your understanding of the case? And that's mostly where if I'm consulting, that's mostly where I would testify or something like that. If you have saliva, if you have a beautiful single source profile in blood, the victim's blood on the suspect or in the suspect's car, I'll still look at it and I'm going to say, yep, looks good. That's her DNA. There's not a whole, unless there's some reason she was in that car and had a nosebleed, or, unless there's some legitimate reason for that blood to be there, there's not a whole lot that I or anyone is going to do as a DNA consultant. So I don't view my role as to like question every DNA sample, or it's mostly, again, about the touch DNA and just being aware and making sure the attorney is aware of the possibilities of transfer, and so that they know the right questions to ask the state's DNA expert on the stand, because they're probably going to answer exactly the same way that I would if the right questions are posed to them. And that didn't always used to be the case, though. I will tell you, when I first started as a consultant, I spent a lot of time reading, reviewing articles, and every year there's more and more and more articles about transfer DNA, both primary transfer and secondary transfer. And when I initially started consulting and testifying, other analysts would routinely say, that doesn't happen. That's so unlikely to happen. That's just an article in maybe if they were aware of a journal article, they would say, well, that's, this hypothetical thing. It doesn't happen in real life. I don't get that anymore. It's be rare, very rare for a DNA analyst to say, oh no, we don't see secondary transfer, because it does happen. And it can even happen in a lab setting where we're trying to be super careful about cleaning, changing gloves, bleaching, everything can still occur. So we know with this increased sensitivity of the testing we have today, it definitely can happen. And it's something that everybody needs to be aware of.
Right. The interesting thing to me about evidence in general, but especially DNA, because DNA is such the gold standard now, is that it's still, even if you have a really good profile, it's still just one cog in the wheel. It's just one piece of evidence. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the person whose DNA profile you have is guilty of the crime or was even there. But all it does is just add one piece to the puzzle. And people need to understand that. And that's one of the reasons that I started this video cast and podcast, is because if people don't understand the significance of evidence that is there or not there, because absence of evidence can also be significant, it's like it doesn't necessarily mean guilt. And I think that's one of the things that the CSI effect has come into play here, where you're saying, look, just because his fingerprint or his DNA or anything else is at the crime scene, well, I mean, fingerprint's a little bit different, but DNA specifically, it could have got there from somewhere else. For example, and help me out if I'm wrong here, but if somebody, for example, is interacting with the person or the victim, for example, at a bar, and then the victim leaves, and then the victim interacts with somebody else, they get that person's DNA who was at the bar but had nothing to do with the crime. All that does is tell one little piece of the puzzle, and it has to be vetted out by the detectives, and that's what detectives are for. But it doesn't necessarily mean that person is the one that committed the crime.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. And that's why we don't want to have tunnel vision, right? We don't want our detectives to have tunnel vision. So there's obviously very famous examples of secondary transfer or investigators having tunnel vision. Like there was a case in Germany, the Phantom of Heilbronn, I think. I don't know my German, but it was, they call it this person the Phantom, right? Because this female was at so many different crime scenes. She was involved in, officer involved shootings, burglaries, robberies, all these cases all over the place in Germany. And they had her profile and they were going to find her, right? And that's it. That's all they looked at. Even when there were witness statements saying, no, there were two people at the scene and they were both males. Or someone saying, yeah, I committed that crime and I'm a male. They didn't want to listen to that because they had a DNA profile. And finally, it turned out it was someone in the swab factory was contaminating swabs. And so it was this female worker in the swab factory that whatever she was doing, she was getting her DNA on swabs that were then used at the crime scene. and she was showing up on, all these different crimes. And,
Didn't
so
like
that's an
wearing gloves
example.
or something.
I mean, this is a little while ago. It was like probably maybe mid 2000s, maybe 2010. I forget. Late enough that we should have known, but it's so that I don't know how that contamination was occurring. I don't know if she was sneezing on things, just touching things directly, coughing. I don't know, but it occurred. And so that I think is a perfect example of tunnel vision, where the detectives didn't want to listen to any witnesses or any, do any other sort of investigation. They had a DNA profile, and that's who their perpetrator was. And there are other examples of secondary transfer, because secondary transfer is difficult to prove. Like in a case sample, you can say it's a possibility, but most of the times, unless it's a journal article research where they have set up an experiment, and so that in that instance they know that it happened and it occurs. But in a case, we don't know, right? We don't know if it was primary, whether it was secondary in most instances. But you may have heard of like the Lucas Anderson case that's occurred in California a couple of years ago. And that was where an individual, Ravi Kumar, remembering correctly, was the victim of a home invasion burglary that basically went bad, and he ended up dying. He asphyxiated. They had put duct tape on him, and he couldn't breathe properly, and he ended up dying. And the laboratory tested many different samples and got some different profiles of different males. Like there were latex gloves left in the sink. So these guys were smart enough to wear gloves not to leave their fingerprints, but then they just left it right there. So they left a beautiful DNA profile. But they tested the nails of the murder victim, and they got a male profile. So enough DNA that they could clearly pull out a foreign male contributor, put it into CODIS, and they got a hit. And so it was on a convicted offender, and he was, in the area. And so they arrested him for participating in this crime. They didn't really have any other link to the other individuals that the DNA was found at the scene as well, but they figured they'd find a link at some point. So he was in jail awaiting trial when his defense attorney and the defense investigator started doing a little digging and found out that he couldn't have committed this crime. And the reason for that was he was in the hospital at the time. So they had hospital records, time, date, stamped. They know exactly when he was there. He was actually basically comatose because was so drunk. He was picked up off the street. Someone called in, someone passed out on the street here. So the paramedics came and got him and realized that, he was very intoxicated. I think it was like a 0.3 something where, he was not functioning. He's in the hospital when at the time this murder is committed. So then the question is, well, how the heck did his DNA get on the victim's nails or under the nails? They looked in the lab. They figured it was contamination somehow, but his profile, his reference sample wasn't there. It's not like they had his reference sample for another crime. It was being processed at the same time. It wasn't there. They didn't have it. There was no possibility of lab contamination. So what they finally figured, and we'll never know this for sure, but what they finally realized is same paramedic team that picked up Mr. Anderson off the street, drunk out of his mind, later that evening went to the home of the murder victim and checked his vitals. And they think it was a pulse oximeter that was placed on Anderson's finger originally, and then put onto Mr. Kumar's finger. And that's how the DNA transferred. That's the best guess that they have right now. So if this guy was not in the hospital with, ironclad alibi, I'm sure he would be, facing trial at this point and potentially convicted.
Well, fortunately, the investigators were able to track that down enough, that there happened to be hospital records. But like I said, nobody should ever get convicted just on one piece of evidence until that evidence has been completely vetted out. And both of us have heard of enough nightmare type stories where people have been wrongfully committed or convicted based on evidence that initially on its face value looks solid, but it can be sketchy when you really start digging into it. So
Right.
I like that. I like that saying, or what you said. Detectives and investigators in general can't have tunnel vision. They've got to be able to look at all the different possibilities. And frankly, that's really what the whole justice system is for, is because then you have a prosecution and a defense, and they're both looking at the same evidence, the same scenario from different points of view. And that's really where justice should be vetted out. And for the most part, it works well. But on occasion, there's a few that slip through the cracks, and those are the ones that obviously they bring in extra experts and reevaluations and more DNA testing and things like that. So,
Well, you hope that they do.
Right, absolutely. That's
and I would say, honestly, I feel like those are the outliers. I mean, if I didn't, then I would be extremely worried about, our justice system. But I think that
right.
in general, most of the time things, there are not these extreme issues,
Right.
but it's just to point out that they can occur. And the problem is that we don't necessarily have a way of proving that they occur. In that case example I gave you, we had a way of proving it. But in most cases, you're not going to have that. You can have a defendant saying, no way, I wasn't there, but are they telling the truth or not? I mean, there's no way to know based upon the DNA alone.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's my whole point. The DNA alone shouldn't be able to exonerate somebody, but it also shouldn't be able to completely convict somebody. So, like I said, it's just one piece of the puzzle. It's a very strong piece, and it's a very important piece. But again, it's just one piece of the puzzle, just like a fingerprint, just like a confession, just like anything else should be. It's just one piece of the puzzle. And that is where I love it when I interact with both CSIs and detectives and lab analysts like yourself, the DNA experts, and finding out from my perspective, I'm not directly involved into the investigative process, but I sure learn a lot from guys, folks like you, because just in discussing a certain DNA case, it's amazing how much I can learn from different things, and especially the whole process, which, by the way, leads me into the next segue. How did you get involved with DNA and eventually being a lab analyst and moving on to being a lab manager?
So, I mean, initially I went to school for biology, but I was actually environmental biology. I thought I was going to be a park ranger. So that was my initial goal. And I still love being outside. I still love, hiking and all of that stuff. But I also went to school in Pennsylvania, where it can get kind of chilly. And we would have these labs early in the morning where we would go outside and, maybe we're like trapping small mammals or looking for birds in my ornithology class, and there'd be snow. And I was a poor college student. I had terrible boots and my feet were always freezing. And I was like, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know. I mean, as much as I love it, I'm not sure about this. And then the other piece was my junior year of college. That was when the O.J. Simpson trial was going on. I guess probably unless you lived during that time, you don't know what a big deal it was and how that's all you heard about on the news. And like every piece of what was happening was, everybody was talking about it. But what really appealed to me was that the fact that they're talking about DNA, talking about genetics, and doing DNA testing. And that was exactly what I was doing in my genetics class at the same time. And I was like, wow, something I'm learning in school, I could actually use in real life. Like could actually be applied. So I liked that aspect of it. And then senior year, all my friends were applying for grad school. And I was like, I don't know if I'm ready. I don't know if I'm ready to not be in school anymore. I thought I was, but I just thought, well, I like forensics. I was taking a chemical analysis, analytical chemistry class, and they talked a lot about how those different instruments could be used to identify different substances. And so I applied for grad school at VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University. And to my surprise, I got in. And that was pretty much it. Then never, that's what once I went and started, I specialized in forensic DNA, and I was like, okay, this is definitely what I want to do. So I think I was lucky in the fact that at that time, that was before CSI, before all the TV shows. And so it was a lot easier to get a job in the field. You know, I have my master's degree, but I didn't technically have to have a master's degree. I probably could have gotten a job without one at that time. And you still can today, but it's a lot harder. It's so competitive anymore to try to get a job in this field. So I was lucky. I got a job right after I graduated in December 98 and had my job like January 2nd, I think I started at Bodie. So I was fortunate in that respect. And that's kind of how I got started in it, and trained immediately for casework analysis at Bodie, and also worked on some other like databasing projects for the government while I was there, while I was doing the training. And then of course, while we were there, we did some other big projects like identifying the victims of the Alaska Airlines crash. And also before I left, victims of the World Trade Center. So I was part of that team where I left in 2002, like November, I think, May or November. I don't know. I'm getting it confused. But in 2002, I left. And by that point, we had already processed 14,000 bone samples from victims of the World Trade Center disaster. So definitely got a lot of experience with casework, as well as, processing difficult samples. And one of the things I liked about Bodie is that, they were innovative and they were trying to figure out ways to get better results from samples that were degraded or had, like you could still smell the jet fuel on them, or they were burnt or whatever. And that's one of the ways that mini STRs came into play, like taking the regular size testing, like we're looking at little chunks of DNA, but it can still be degraded to the point you don't get a result. So if you take those chunks of DNA and make it even smaller that you're trying to look at, that chunk of DNA, that small chunk, might give you a result. And that's what a mini STR is. And so now those mini STRs are actually incorporated into all of the tests we do. So the kits have become so advanced that, for example, we use Global Filer at my lab. So instead of initially we looked at like 9 or 13 loci and then up to 16. Now we're looking at 24 loci in one test, and it includes mini STRs. So you're likely to get a result even if you have a very degraded sample.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then you went to Florida, and then you moved out to California after how much time?
So I was in Florida for about 3.5 years, worked for the Department of Law Enforcement there in Tampa. And then I actually moved to Charlotte before that. So I moved to Charlotte and worked for the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department in their crime lab. And then I took a job at a private lab in San Diego. So that's when I moved out to California. So I've been out here since. So I've been here longer than anywhere other than Pennsylvania, where I grew up at this point. So I've been here about 15 years, something like that. That lab. So I worked for a private lab. We were accredited. We were doing testing and moving along. And then our lab director passed away pretty unexpectedly. It was skin cancer. So he was diagnosed, and then 9 weeks later, he passed away. So it was pretty rough. So the lab kind of shut down shortly after that. And then that's when I started consulting, because I had also just bought a house, was gonna have my first baby, all these, got married, all those things. It's great because it allowed me to still remain active in the field, but be home a lot more than I normally would have with my son. And so I'm at the time, it was very stressful and I thought it was a bad thing, but in retrospect, I think it's probably, one of the better things that could have happened, that I went into consulting at that time.
And now with Pure Gold Forensics, as well as Ryan Forensics private consulting. So now I would should get fired if I didn't actually ask you some question about the M-Vac. So first of all, as objective as possible, what is your experience and understanding and opinion of the M-Vac? And then if there's any particular casework, and not necessarily talking about the victims or anything, but if you could just talk about how the M-Vac has helped on certain pieces of evidence, that would be awesome.
So I started using the M-Vac in 2015, And if you recall, he came out to train me, and that was that's the M-Vac that we use for pro bono work at ASOC. So I've done a number of cases for ASOC where I donate my time and resources and everything to do the collection, and then we'll send those samples out to, maybe the the state lab or wherever the agency would like us to send those M-Vac filters. So because I've been using it for so long, I have had the opportunity to work on lots of different kinds of samples. And I always try to follow. So if I don't actually do the DNA testing on the samples, I try to follow up at least with, well, did the lab get results or what happened? And so I kind of try to keep track of that. And obviously I prefer to be able to do the DNA testing myself, because then I know. And I know that, not to say that other analysts are not going to do a good job. I'm sure they are, but it's, it's like, it becomes kind of like your baby, right? Like you work on this piece of evidence and you've got, you want to case and you talk with the investigator and you really just want to MVAC that thing and get any DNA off of there that you can. And then if you don't hear the results or you don't get to do the testing and don't know, well, did they concentrate the sample or how did they extract it? Or, like all these little things that I know can improve the results or have you give a better chance of getting results. Drives me crazy, but that's okay. I mean, I'm just glad to be able to use it and be able to offer that to investigators. But the cases that I have worked myself, I've had some really, really good successes. I mean, like I'm not going to lie, not everything is going to give you a result. Like I pretty much always get something. It's very rare for me to MVAC something and not get some DNA. Many times or sometimes it's a mixture. And if we had a suspect, perhaps we could do a comparison, but it's not eligible for upload to CODIS. So that can happen when you're dealing with low levels of DNA and mixtures. But it's rare for me to not get at least some sort of result. And we've had some really, really good cases and really interesting cases and results that I would not have anticipated getting, including results from samples that have been buried for a couple of years. So, you have this presumption of, as a DNA analyst, of I'm never going to get a result from that. Like, there's just no way. It's going to be too degraded, too exposed, whatever. And I think that sometimes, it's important to have give an educated guess or talk with the investigator and saying, that's probably not your best item of evidence. But that being said, I will always tell an investigator, hey, I'm willing to try it and we will do our best to try to get something, because you never know. Sometimes I have samples where I think I will get a profile and I don't get a very good profile. Sometimes I have samples that I'm thinking, oh, this has already been tested. It's already been swabbed. I don't think I'm not going to get very much. And I get a beautiful profile, more than what the swab gave, which is not unusual. And that is, of course, what the FBI results showed, and other, agencies have seen, that even if something has already been swabbed, you can still get results with the MVAC. So that's pretty amazing to me, especially working on cold cases where many times the items have already been tested. I mean, we've had like I said, I can't go into specifics. It was a ligature, and it's possible that it had been left in place when the medical examiner washed the body. So it would have been sprayed off, sprayed down. Then it was swabbed and tested by the state lab, and very minimal results were obtained. So I'm thinking, oh, sure. I said, yeah, of course, we'll MVAC it. It's possible we'll pull up more. I don't know. But I wasn't real confident in getting results. But I did. And we got more, we got a YSTR profile, and it was more than what the previous lab had obtained. And we were able to compare it to a suspect with, positive results. And it wasn't just that sample. There were other samples in that same case that getting similar results. So that was pretty exciting to me, that even though it had been tested and, had not been in the greatest condition, I'm still able to get usable results. So yeah, I mean, it's not, as I've heard you said many times, the MVAC is not for every single sample. If you can see the stain, cut it out, swab it, whatever. If you know where exactly the perpetrator touch something, then yeah, you could swab something, but most of the time we don't know. So it's better if you have something that is cloth, or fabric, or a rope, or some sort of ligature, bricks and rocks, things like that. I would always, wooden boards, I would always recommend the M-Vac versus swabbing, just because I've seen the results, so it's not just a theoretical thing. I know what it can do, and I know that you can get some pretty amazing results using M-Vac. So I'm definitely, the more I use it, the more I'm a proponent of it, for sure.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I'll tell you, I gave my first virtual kind of Zoom type of a presentation to a police chief's conference yesterday,
Okay.
and it was pretty amazing, bizarre at the same time. As I was talking to him, I said, "Hey, on a scale of 1 to 10, tell me what your experience with the M-Vac is." And there were tons and tons of ones, and I was like, "Oh." As a marketer, I'm failing. But the good thing about it is they're learning about it. And there's what, 680,000 police officers, law enforcement officers out there, and who know how many thousands of DNA analysts, and you can't reach them all, but eventually they're all going to learn. And at least a significant number are going to learn, like what you just said, that the M-Vac isn't for every sample. But if you have a degraded sample, or it's on a rough or a really porous surface, or touch DNA, that is like the ideal scenario. And especially now that the FBI data has come out, it's just one of those where if an agency or a lab doesn't have at least access to an M-Vac, man, they should, because I think there's a lot of cases that unfortunately are going to get either put to the side, or sampled with the wrong, I can't really say the wrong, because you do the best you can with what you have.
Right.
But if there's another tool that could do a much better job on that particular scenario, and you just don't have access to it, to me, that's a shame.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the other issue is, funding in general, just the funding that agencies have, because like I said, this isn't every case. Certainly I've used M-Vac on current cases as well. I mean, this is not just cold cases. My colleague at the lab has used it on current homicide cases, and again, gotten some great results. So it's more, what is the item of evidence? What is the substrate that we're trying to get the DNA off of? But funding can be an issue, I think, especially for cold cases. And so I did want to mention something that I recently learned about. I texted you about this, Jared, recently, is this, it's called Season of Justice. And my understanding is that it is linked in some way with the Crime Junkies podcast. And I could be wrong about that, but that's my understanding. That's what was relayed to me by Joe Kennedy. So anyway, the reason I wanted to bring it up is, if people are listening to this that that are investigators or are involved with cold cases, this organization, Season of Justice, is providing grants for DNA testing. You have to apply, but it's on a case-by-case basis, and they'll take a look. And I already have a couple of cases that are coming my way for M-Vac testing because of that. And the agency just didn't have the money before. They wanted the testing. Well, where do we get the funds for this? So I think that's a great way to, these agencies that just don't have the funding, to be able to reach out and say, okay, I've got 1, 2, 3, whatever samples that I'd like tested, and they might be able to get the funding for that.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's one of the biggest problems with law enforcement in general, is just the lack of funding that these guys, to see what they can actually do for the community based on the budgets that they're given. That alone is just a miracle. But once you get into the DNA testing, it's expensive, and people need to understand that. But it's like, and that's why they use it sparingly, and say, yeah, we can't just for every case test 50 samples. It's just monetarily, it's just impossible to do. But being able to, especially for particular cases that we would put in like the difficult category, it's awesome to see more funding like this, especially if it's coming from the private sector, and because everybody needs to get involved. And This is a societal problem, being able to solve cases. Some people say, well, I don't know the victim. I wasn't a part of that. They were from across town. It doesn't matter. Ultimately, it will come back to either benefit or haunt you. And so being able to, cold cases to me are the bane of society, because
and there's hundreds of thousands of them. There are hundreds of
Yes.
thousands of cold cases right now.
Just homicides.
Anyway.
I think,
Oh yeah.
I think if you start adding rapes and assaults and, just the major three,
Oh yeah.
I think that blooms into millions. And,
Oh yeah.
and it's sad because on the end of every single one of those cases are victims and victims' families and the community.
Right.
And
Right.
the community as a whole. And I would even lump in investigators into that victim category, because like you said, you get involved, it becomes kind of like your baby, and you actually become emotionally involved into some of these cases, because you're like, you have to learn what the scenario behind the evidence is. And I know that especially as a DNA analyst, you have to remain objective, because it has to be fair both to the prosecution and the defense. But at the same time, you're a human, and especially as a mom, and you're going to be involved with seeing that victim. And as a dad, I look at some of these victims that have kids, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's just, how can you not get involved? But that aside, I mean, that's kind of a side note. But the bottom line is the community has to get involved with understanding and helping crime whenever they can. And if they're not, then that's a shame as well.
Sure. Yeah. And, I mean, to your point, yes, I get involved, but I just want the best DNA results that will either include or exclude the suspect. I want the right person. If that person committed the crime, then I want them to be punished for that crime. If they didn't, then I want them exonerated. You know what I mean? Like that. And that's why I'm such a believer in DNA, because I think it has the power to do that in conjunction with investigations and other circumstantial evidence and things like that. So I become involved because I always want the best DNA profile developed that is the most useful and helpful for moving the case along.
Right. And frankly, I think every DNA analyst is the same way. And they are borderline perfectionists in their work, and it's much more objective on the lab side, but at the same time, it's such a key piece. And the more I learn about DNA and the processes that happens within the lab, the more amazed I become. So you guys do some pretty amazing work.
We try. We try. And you're right. I mean, the vast majority, and I think I said this earlier, if you are to ask any DNA analyst the right questions on the stand, like even if I'm on the defense side of something, I know that if I write a question about DNA or transfer DNA or whatever, if this is an analyst who is well-versed, has done what they need to do, which is remain educated, continuing education, stay up on the evolving, DNA analysis methods and whatever, then I know that they're going to answer, like I said, the same way that I'm going to answer, and I have that expectation. And it's rare. It does happen, but it's rare that it happens that there's a different answer. And that's why you have consultants, or that's why you have outside experts. DNA analysts get into this field because they have a passion for their work and they want to, help solve crimes. It's, I don't think it's the high pay, I mean, consulting is different, yeah, you get paid more for consulting, but you're putting yourself on the line a little bit more sometimes than working in the lab. But people in the lab, they're not they're being paid, but it's not the, like, you go into this job like a doctor, lawyer, or whatever, like, oh, I'm going to make a bunch of money. It's, it's more about helping society, solving cases, being a part of the justice system in that manner.
Absolutely. Hey, on that note, I've kept you a long time, so I definitely appreciate your time. And boy, it's been fantastic. And the best thing about this show is we can always do it again. So
Are you saying it wasn't very good?
Oh,
Like we need
that's
to redo
exactly
this.
what I'm saying, Susanna. Oh my gosh. What an absolute miserable experience I've had the last hour. And,
Yeah,
man, if I even
yeah.
post this, who knows?
Whole thing's crashing down.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just going in the junk heap.
All
No.
right.
You are awesome. I appreciate you, and I totally respect everything you're doing. There's reasons that I send lots of referrals to you. As agencies call M-Vac Systems, you guys are one of the first ones that say, "Hey, you need to talk to Suzanna down there at Pure Gold Forensics." So.
Oh, awesome. We appreciate that. So thank you. Yeah, keep them coming. We're happy to answer questions. Even if we end up not getting the case, for me, that's great. I would like to get cases, but I also like to be able to just assist. So if there are people that have questions, they can feel free to email or call me. That's completely fine.
Fantastic. And I will include your, the Pure Gold Forensics website. Great. And if there's any other information that you want me to put in the post, or on the YouTube description as far as how to get a hold of you, then just let me know and I'll then get that up there. So, all right, Suzanna.
Sounds good. Very cool.
Thank you so much.
All right. Sure. All right. Thank you. You have a good rest of your day.
You too. Talk to you later.
Take care. Okay. Bye-bye.